Welcome to the human population. Age structure diagrams are visual aids that show the distribution of males and females in each age group. The percentages of males and females in the total population are divided into the following categories. Pre-reproductive ages span birth to 14 years. Reproductive ages include 15 through 44, and you can see I've got those boxed off. And then post-reproductive ages include 45 and up. If a country has more young people than old people, its age structure diagram will be wider at the bottom. This is called a population pyramid. This is typical of developing countries. The wide base indicates the population will grow because of the large number of females yet to have children. Population momentum is the phenomenon where populations keep growing after birth control policies or voluntary birth reductions have begun to lower crude birth rate of a country. This is because it takes time for actions that attempt to reduce births to catch up with a growing population. Countries with little difference between the numbers of individuals in different age groups look more like a column. This is typical of developed countries that have slow or no growth rate. A country with more older people than younger people has a diagram that resembles an inverted pyramid. Such a country has a fertility rate below 2.1 and a decreasing number of females within each younger age. Total fertility rate is an estimate of the average number of children that each woman in a population will bear throughout her reproductive years. Average in the United States is 2.1. Replacement level fertility is the total fertility rate required to offset the average number of deaths in a population so that the current population size remains stable, usually just over 2 due to pre-reproductive mortality. Developed countries are ones with a relatively high levels of industrialization and income. Developing countries have relatively low levels of industrialization and incomes are less than $3 per day. Many factors that influence birth and fertility rates include more children work in developing countries. They're important to the labor force. The economic cost of raising and educating children determines their numbers. If there is available private-public pension systems, adults have fewer children because they don't need children to take care of them in their old age. Or people in urban areas usually have better access to family planning, so they have fewer children. If women have educational and economic choices, they tend to have fewer children. The older the age at which women marry, the fewer children they bear. If abortions are available and legal, women have fewer children. And the availability of reliable birth control allows women to space children and determines the number of children that they bear. Life expectancy is the average number of years that an infant born in a particular year in a particular country can be expected to live, given the current average lifespan and death rate in that country. Why are people living longer? Well, we have increased food supply and distribution, we have better nutrition and medical advances, and improved sanitation and infrastructure. Infant mortality rate is the number of babies out of every 1,000 born who die before their first birthday. Availability of prenatal care is an important predictor of infant mortality. U.S. infant mortality rate is higher than most developed countries because of inadequate health care for poor women and for their babies, drug addiction among pregnant women, and high birth rates among teenagers. Child mortality rate is the number of deaths of children under age 5 per 1,000 live births. If a country has a high life expectancy and low infant mortality rate, that country has a high level of available health care, adequate food supply, potable drinking water, sanitation, and moderate level of pollution. In some cases, life expectancy and infant mortality in a given sector of a country's population differ wildly from life expectancy and infant mortality of the country as a whole. Every 5 days, the human population increases by roughly 1 million people. The global human population has grown more rapidly in the last 400 years than at any other time in history. This was mainly due to increased agricultural outputs and improving sanitation. Population growth has slowed, but it is still growing exponentially. The vast majority of all growth occurs in less developed countries. In 2050, it is projected there will be 8.1 to 9.6 billion people on Earth, with the population stabilizing somewhere between 6.8 and 10.5 billion people in 2100. In 1798, Thomas Malthus noticed that the human population was growing exponentially, while the food supply was only growing linearly. He concluded that the human population would eventually exceed its food supply. Some scientists believe that Earth does not have a carrying capacity for humans because we have intellect that leads to innovations. Demography is the study of human populations and population trends. Demographers are scientists in this field. Population increases through births and immigration and decreases through deaths and immigration. Immigration is the movement of people into a country, and immigration is the movement of people out of a country. The crude birth rate is the number of live births per 1,000 individuals per year, and the crude death rate is the number of deaths per 1,000 individuals per year. The global population growth rate equals crude birth rate minus crude death rate divided by 10. Because birth and death rates are expressed per 1,000 people, we divide by 10 to represent the value as a percentage. The growth rate of a nation equals crude birth rate plus immigration minus crude death rate plus immigration divided by 10. Doubling time is the number of years it takes for a population to double, assuming the growth rate is constant. Doubling time in years equals 70 divided by the growth rate for the country. Crude death rate is higher in countries with large elderly populations, usually countries with longer life expectancies. Some problems with rapid population decline are threats to economic growth, labor shortages due to younger people not replacing older people as they retire, less government revenues with fewer workers paying into retirement or pension programs, less entrepreneurship, less likelihood for new technology development, and increasing public deficits to fund higher pension and health care costs. There also may be a lack of health care workers to provide for the number of older people that outstrip the number of younger people in the population. Infectious diseases are the second biggest killer worldwide after heart disease. Historically, tuberculosis and malaria were responsible for the largest number of deaths, but today it's HIV/AIDS. It's responsible for most deaths from infectious diseases annually. Deaths from diseases such as AIDS disrupt a country's social and economic structure. Large numbers of people in a particular age group, 15 to 49, which tends to be our reproductive years, are removed from the country's future. Life expectancy drops, child and infant mortality increase, and population growth declines. HIV/AIDS has had more of a disruptive effect on society than other illnesses because the deaths are mostly young adults, and those are who usually help run the country in everyday life. Women have fewer children when they are educated, in control of their fertility, earn an income, and live in societies that do not suppress their rights. In most developing countries, women attend school on average and only half as long as men do. Family planning is the regulation of the number of or spacing of offspring through the use of birth control. Information is given on birth spacing, birth control, and health care. Family planning has been responsible for at least 55% of the drop in total fertility rates in developing countries. Family planning has also reduced both legal and illegal abortions per year. Services come through educational and clinical services. 42% of pregnancies in developing countries are unplanned, and 26% end in abortion. Women want to limit their pregnancies but have no access to contraceptives. India has tried to control its population growth for years. Poverty, malnutrition, and environmental problems abound in India. Efforts to limit population have not been especially successful because poor couples believe they need several children for work and care, and there is a strong preference for male children, so many do not use birth control. India is currently undergoing tremendous economic growth that will likely continue. This may increase the ecological footprint of the nation, but may also serve to hasten the demographic transition. 20% of the human population consumes about 50% of Earth's resources. About 6 billion people live in developing countries, with under 1.5 billion living in developed countries. The 30 wealthiest countries have an average ecological footprint of 15.8 acres per capita. while the 50 poorest countries have an average ecological footprint of 2.5 acres per capita. Affluence is the state of having high levels of money, goods, or property. Affluence results in high levels of consumption and can lead to unsustainable addiction to acquiring material things. It can also lead, however, to better education, improved health, and more resources to address environmental problems. 1/5 of the world population lives in extreme poverty. Poverty conditions in heavily populated areas can have significant environmental impacts. Pollution and environmental degradation can have severe impacts on the poor. 3 significant health issues are malnutrition, inadequate sanitation, and access to safe drinking water, and respiratory disease. The theory of demographic transition states that as a country moves from a subsistence economy to industrialization and increased affluence, it undergoes a predictable shift in population. Growth in countries does not always follow the 4 phases. Nicaragua has a declining population but has the industrial activity of a developing country. China is a transitional country, but its growth rate has slowed due to the government's one-child policy, which is now a 2-child policy. Phase 1 is slow population growth. It's pre-industrial. It's at a near steady state with high birth and high death rates. People tend to have a short life expectancy, and there's high infant mortality. It tends to be a subsistence economy, meaning most people are farmers and are subsisting off of what they can grow. Lack of health care, poor sanitation. Parents tend to rely on children to care for them in their old age. Therefore, children are an economic benefit. Most every nation has moved out of phase 1. However, war, famine, and disease, especially AIDS, has pushed some countries back to phase 1. Example is Lesotho in Africa. Rapid population growth, stage 2, a transitional country. Death rates decline while birth rates remain high, so there's a large total fertility rate. There tends to be better sanitation, clean drinking water, and increased access to food, goods, and health care. India is an example of a transitional country in phase 2. Phase 3 is stable population growth. These tend to be industrialized countries. The birth rate and death rates decrease, so it returns to a steady state. Economy and educational systems improve, income increases. Children become an economic burden at this point. And examples of countries in phase 3 are the United States and Canada. Declining population growth is phase 4. This is a post-industrial economy. It has a declining population due to higher proportion of elderly people and lower proportion of younger people due to fewer births and a lower total fertility rate. Pension programs and social securities tend to be strained. People need to immigrate into the country in order to care for the elderly, and it has a relatively high influence in economic development. Examples of countries in phase 4 are Japan, the UK, Germany, and Russia. Recent studies suggest that total fertility rate increases after reaching a low of 1.2 to 1.5 children per woman, and examples of this are Norway and Italy.